What do I have to get involved with Putin for? I have nothing to do with Putin. I've never spoken to him. I don't know anything about him other than he will respect me. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
You are listening to TMI for the week of July 16th, 2018.
This week on the show, Ace Hoffman. He is presented at 200 plus NRC hearings, written for Counterpunch, produced bits for Dr. Demento, hoards books on the nuclear industry, and has been asking tough questions about nuclear for over 40 years. Ace Hoffman is a software developer with 35 years' experience. He creates educational software for adults. Several products are available on his website, www.animatedsoftware.com. Nuclear's always been in the back of your mind.
In the front, yeah. It's always been nuclear and then other issues. In 1979, for 3 Mile Island, I was actually taking a course in broadcasting called Connecticut School of Broadcasting. And so I created a comedy routine, which featured cut-ins of Beatles songs. And then I was the reporter for a report about 3 Mile Island. And that was played on the Dr. Demento show, which was on the air for 40 years or so. And in fact, he played it 4 out of the last 5 decades, so almost 50 years of comedy on nuclear issues. And then after Chernobyl, I did one about that too, and a couple of others related to like the gas shortage from that era and related things.
Well, the more I look at your webpage and see the diversity of things that you're interested in, I don't know why I'm surprised. The other half of the people I've had on the show are comedians, so I had no idea the comedy connection. Can we hear the Dr. Demento thing? Is it alive on the internet somewhere?
Yeah, actually, I've posted it on my YouTube channel, and added some video to make it a video thing. But it's the actual Dr. Demento recording. In fact, I gave the original with the actual cuts on reel-to-reel tape to WBAI in New York. And I believe they played it, but they also never returned it. So that's lost to the ages. And the best recording available was from Dr. Demento. So he actually sent me a digital file of it that I then used to put it online.
So to paint a picture here, so you run an animation software company. You program.
Right.
You've studied broadcasting. I understand you were doing a radio show in the 90s.
Yeah, I guess I did do one for a little while in the late 80s or early 90s. I think it was in the 80s. And that was on a very small station where you actually had to buy the time yourself. So I think it only broadcast during the night, and the range I don't know what the range was, but the number of listeners was probably in single digits. So, but I did save all those recordings. Say again?
Wow.
What was it?
No, I'm just wowing at your all of this. So what's fascinating for me, I'm on episode 52 here. So it sort of marks a year of weekly podcasts.
Yeah, wow. Congratulations.
If you take a couple weeks off, though, it's hard to get rolling again. And you ask questions like, should I keep going? And so what are your thoughts on that? You stopped. Now we're in a culture of all these podcasts. Maybe there should be an Ace Hoffman podcast.
I've considered doing it. One of the I wanted to mention, this might be encouraging to you, one of the broadcasts that I did for the radio station, I then transcribed and posted it on the internet. It was a broadcast condemning the use of radioactive materials in outer space. And then Carl Grossman, who was a investigative reporter from Long Island, found the thing that I had posted and contacted me and said, "Did you know that they're going to launch something called Cassini, which is going to have 72.3 pounds of plutonium-238 on board?" And I'm like, wow, I didn't even realize that. This was back in the 1990s, I guess, or mid 90s. And so I then joined him and several others in protesting the use of the launching of Cassini. And he and I have been friends basically ever since. And that's what really got me started doing the blogging and being more active in my nuclear efforts.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, even NASA has a statistical probability for a failed launch.
It's
I think
quite
it's
high.
1 in 220.
Oh, at least, yeah. Well,
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds great. It's all for science and we're studying the stars and stuff, but, would you fly a plane with that same risk model?
right, or would you launch radioactive spent fuel into outer space with that kind of a risk?
Right.
It's preposterous. Many people still think that that's the way to get rid of the waste because once it's gone forever. But getting it out of Earth orbit takes an enormous amount of energy. Getting it into Earth orbit is difficult enough, but the risk of failure is just so high that you're never going to be able to launch it all. And even if the risk were low, the cost would be pretty much prohibitive.
It's also just humorously an interesting way of framing a waste we can't deal with. If the only solution is to put it off planet, it's not a viable byproduct, obviously.
Absolutely correct, right. And the pro-nukers have said, well, we can dump it in the ocean. We can put it under the ice caps. We can just spread it out, and it'll be such a low radiation risk that nobody needs to worry. I mean, they've come up with every possible solution that they can think of, and none of them are practical. There are no practical solutions.
Except not making more.
It's the first step, is to not make more. An interesting thing happened here in California, in Southern California, which is, now I had been attending every single NRC hearing about San Onofre, the local nuclear power plant, for over 20 years. And there were just a few other people that would attend most of these hearings until very near the end. After Fukushima, people got more interested. And also after 9/11, there was an uptick in interest. But there was very little interest in what to do with the nuclear waste. Once the plant closed, now suddenly all the activists that are left are interested in the nuclear waste issue, because that's all we have here is a pile of nuclear waste. And the average response is, well, get it out of here and send it to somebody else, which of course is called a NIMBY response, and it's not sufficient. But at least activists are concerned about the nuclear waste, and some of them are being a lot smarter about it than just get it out of here.
Something I actually would like I'd like to tell you what I understand about San Onofre, and see where I'm right and where I'm wrong in the story of San Onofre. But one just note I wanted to add was, when you do the risk model calculation, the risk to local inhabitants before the shutdown and after the shutdown, it's a huge win for California, is it not?
It certainly, yeah.
That it's closed. You've got a decommissioning problem, but at least this thing is closed.
Right, absolutely. In fact, in my estimation, and who can tell the real numbers, but in my estimation, the Diablo nuclear power plant, which is about 200 miles, 180 miles away from here, is a much greater risk to the local residents here near San Onofre than the spent fuel that's sitting in dry casks and a spent fuel pool is, because Diablo Canyon is still operating.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of controversy about the seismology around Diablo Canyon.
Right. But besides that, there are operator error can cause an accident, of old faulty parts that finally fall apart, terrorism, asteroids, tsunamis, earthquakes. There's lots of ways that it could melt down.
Sure.
And there's 2 reactors there, so you could have a double failure like we saw at Fukushima. So that, to me, that's maybe 1,000 times more risky than the spent fuel here at San Onofre. But of course, the localists are only concerned about the issue, and none of them are, or essentially none of them are that concerned about Diablo Canyon, which I think is really a shame.
San Onofre got on my radar. Stories were coming out after Fukushima and it was about the replacing of the steam generators by Mitsubishi.
Mm-hmm.
And around the time, I think, after they had replaced them, and they saw that there were faults developing, and I think there was radiation had leaked into some of the coolant water, and then the news story was a worker had fallen into that water, and things were, and I think this is just as they were deciding that these steam generators weren't going to cut it. That's how it came out in the news.
Yeah,
that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, it all started around 2003, I would say, when they were making the decision to replace the steam generators, and
okay.
at that point, it appears, now some of this is unprovable, but it unless we get records that are hard to find, that they actually ran the reactor. If they had made it run a little bit less, just a couple of percent,
yeah.
So there would have been less profit, but there would have been plenty of energy that they were producing. If they had just run it a little bit less, the old steam generators would not have needed so many tubes to be plugged, and so then they could have lasted an extra couple of years. But they actually ran it good and hot and fast, and caused more and more of the tubes of the old generators to need to be plugged up. Each time they would shut down, they'd have to plug a certain number of tubes. And so they estimated when they were going to need to plug so many that they would not be allowed to run anymore. It's like 18 or 20%, something like that.
Wow.
And then they had this company in Colorado, Aspen Environmental, something or other like that, do a study which determined that if they replaced the steam generators, they would supposedly save the ratepayers $1.2 billion over the course of the 20 years that they would operate. And this wasn't much of a savings, because the cost of doing the steam generator replacement was estimated at well over $1 billion. So really, it wasn't a big deal, but they took out a lot of the costs that they had originally included in their request for the steam generator replacement money, and they brought it down to $670-something million. And the way they did that was they took the reactor pressure vessel head replacement and made it a separate job, even though it was going to be $100-something million and be done at the same time, and it originally had been included. And they did other accounting tricks to lower the price. And the environmental group that did the study, they call themselves environmental, the Aspen company, never did any estimate about what happens if it doesn't last 20 years. What happens if it only lasts 15, or if it only lasts 11 months, which is what it turned out to be. They never did a single study based on the idea that it actually wouldn't work. So that was one of the problems. And then another thing is they said they were going to use a higher quality steel inside of the, for the tubes. They never bothered to say that it had a 10% less thermal conductivity. So therefore, they'd need to make longer tubes and pack more of them into the steam generators in order to get the same amount of output that they had got from the original one, because it had to be a, quote, like-for-like replacement. So the steam generators had to be the same size. But they saw like-to-like as simply meaning the same size. Internally, they were very different. And they didn't want to talk about that, because if they had, they would have had to go through a public hearings and NRC approval. And the NRC probably realized that they were getting the wool pulled over their eyes, but they didn't care either. So the net result was...
Well, this is something I wanted to touch on, and you've touched on it already, because one of the comments that's made about this whole fiasco at San Onofre is that this like-for-like term meant that they didn't have to have public hearings, and its speculation is that had they had public hearings, somebody, an expert witness or whoever, would have pointed out, well, this isn't like-for-like, and it's totally redesigned, and it's overrated. They plan on overrunning it to increase their output, which it sounds like they had already been doing with the old generator.
It turns out they probably ran it extra hot when they put the new ones in, too.
Yeah.
They were experimenting with how hot they could run it, and instead it broke.
So what about this idea that had they had public hearings, chances are this thing, the replacement, this deal with Mitsubishi, would have not gone through. They would have spent more time looking at whether it was a like-for-like replacement.
Well, the two don't really go together. If they had public hearings, it would have been because it was not like-for-like. As long as it was like-for-like,
right,
they didn't need the public hearings. So it would have come out that they were different. And whether or not anyone would have looked carefully enough at whether the differences were significant is anybody's guess. But the NRC seems to approve everything, so, and the public seems to not be allowed to influence the decisions. So I mean, the local public feels pretty strongly that it was the opposition to the replacement job of the opposition to restarting it that finally got the plant permanently closed. I don't know if that's true. The financial obligation was to run it at 70% power, which was the original proposal, to run it at 70% power for 5 months and see how whether or not there was any damage. They weren't going to make any money. I mean, it just wasn't financially, it wasn't making any sense. So perhaps the activists had something to do with it, but we'll never know.
Well, it's of some interest to me because the trend here in Canada is, and I think you guys do this in the United States, to thwart and avoid a public hearing, you'll combine two applications together, maybe one to build and one to operate, and you skip it. Or whereas licenses may have been shorter periods in the past, up here now the trend is trying to go for 10-year licenses. Some people will be dead by the time there's any more public hearings. The trend is, I think, to phase out public hearings.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I first started going to public hearings here in Southern California, they would actually make us all stand and put our hand up or over our hearts or wherever and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And they stopped doing that after a couple of years. They certainly, like you say, they give combined construction and operating licenses right from the get-go. How that's possible, I don't know. And we have 20-year licenses in America, so you're lucky to have 5 or 10. But yeah, and it's very difficult to get any kind of hearing on a petition from the public. It's called a 2.206, and most of them are rejected out of hand. It's hard to get a word in edgewise. You get to say something, they don't have to respond.
Okay. Let me ask you this. When you were forced to swear with your hand over your heart, were the people behind the panel and expert witnesses for the proponent required to swear in and take an oath?
Oh, absolutely. The whole room was sworn in at once.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
At least they're sworn to tell the truth. Up here, there's no swearing. There's no oath.
It doesn't happen anymore, though. It hasn't happened in 20 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, I complained to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that the public affairs person from San Onofre was blatantly lying, and they responded that the statements of public affairs officers of nuclear utilities are not regulated comments and will not be investigated by the NRC, which is permission for them to lie.
That's technically military or government propaganda, depending on who owns the reactors. I mean, up here, they're owned by the provincial government. It's more I argue it's easier to understand nuclear in Canada because, at least in the case of Ontario, it's actually the province, the government, that owns the actual reactors. There's one case of a plant where it's run by an operator and middleman, because our electricity doesn't seem to be expensive enough. We had to have a middleman. But essentially, because the owner of the plant is the proponent, at least they're identifiable and usual suspects at our hearings. Whereas in the United States, there's a whole wide variety of owners and operators and utilities and conglomerates.
Yeah, I don't know which is better. Because the Department of Energy here is a proponent of nuclear power as well as the regulator, and the NRC is paid almost entirely by the utilities, so they have a vested interest in keeping as many of them open as possible. 90% of their funding is from the utilities.
It's very similar here in terms of how the CNSC funds itself, but the sort of the punchline is that the CNSC, our nuclear regulator, is housed in the ministry responsible for exporting uranium. So a little bit of a conflict there, too.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was your commissioner chairs. So it was Greg Zacco. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And now it's McFarland, but her term came up in June. Is she still the NRC chair?
No, and I don't know the name of the current one. It's pronounced Jasko.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's Yasko Yasko, I think is how Greg Yasko. He was very influential, perhaps, in getting our reactor shut down, because after he was basically kicked out as chairman because of his stance on feeling that Fukushima should result in some new regulations, basically. He and the former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan, were brought to a hearing here in San Diego. That one of the activists gathered them together, and Peter Bradford was also at the hearing, and that was on a Tuesday, and I think it was that Friday that they announced that the reactors were going to be permanently, that the plant was going to shut down permanently. So it's quite possible that hearing, the things that those guys had to say at that hearing was the most important thing. If the activists had anything to do with it, that was probably that was the linchpin event that closed the plant. Although it could be argued that they made the decision earlier, or they would have made it anyway, or whatever.
Well, there's an interesting moment towards the end of his reign. Wasn't there a deadline after which no licenses would be approved? And so there was this big rush to have license extensions come in before a date, and I think it was after this date was implemented, was if there wasn't a solution to the nuclear waste on site, then no more licenses would be approved. So they got flooded with a whole bunch of license extensions all before the deadline. Does that ring a bell?
It does sort of ring a bell, but obviously that didn't work out that way, because there's a 45-year-old boiling water reactor that I forget which one, that's just applied for an extension to their license to operate for a total of 80 years. So the first reactor to ask for to operate that long, and it's 12 or 13 years before their current license expires. So obviously they have some reason why they want to get this out of the way good and early. There's no conceivable reason why they should do this before they're 2 or 3 years prior to the end of their current license, and yet here we are some 13 years prior, and they're already applying for the license.
I sent you some links to these Canadian hearings. I don't really actually think that you would watch them, because they actually go on for hours, because there's a back and forth in them. But you watched. Sorry,
all of them.
Watched a little bit of some of them.
I watched all of them.
Okay, all right. My question for you is, what can you tell me about the difference from watching them in how American regulatory hearings are held and conducted, or the rules? What do you think of the difference in how the regulator deals with hearings and public participation?
One of the first differences is they didn't seem to put in absurd time limits on the. There were some time limits on the public's ability to speak, but here we're invariably limited to 3 and sometimes only 2 minutes. I can't recall the last time. Once in a while, I guess they're 5 minutes, and every so often they're open-ended, but usually it's 3 minutes. And
well, I think those 3 that I sent you are sort of examples of the sort of the big shots of nuclear regulatory presenters. And so everybody gets 10 minutes, but very often you say your 10 minutes and they're on to the next. There is no back and forth or supplementary questions or comment on answers.
It was nice to see the back and forth. It was quite cool. But in terms of the quality of the regulators, they didn't seem any better. I mean, they were ignoring spent fuel problems, accidents, alternatives. When they talk about nuclear power not creating greenhouse gases, they're ignoring mining, milling, processing the uranium, and the thousands of people that work at the plants who are wasting energy just getting to and from work and existing, and their families. They
solve all those logistical questions by 2 means. One is the regulator is sort of interested up to the fence line, largely, of the plant.
Yeah, that
and
sounds
2,
about right.
all those other decisions like alternatives or how much it costs or ethics or military proliferation or any of those things, the way they've set it up is they've got the federal government as the regulator, and all those other decisions, health, evacuation, risk model, I mean, every possible other aspect of it is really delegated to the province, and there are no public hearings for any of those other issues. So the only public hearings we get are these hearings where the mandate of the regulator is really narrowed down to atoms and fence lines, really.
Yeah, they compartmentalize here too. In New Mexico, where they're thinking about putting all of the nuclear waste, one of the senators tried to send questions to various state regulatory agencies. And even though he was asking questions that clearly they would be able to answer, like what are the number of gas and wells within a 50-mile radius of the location, the regulatory agencies that he asked the questions of simply turned the entire thing over to say, the feds have to answer these questions, the NRC has to answer these questions, this is not our department. When clearly it was as if they hadn't read the questions at all, because some of those questions were clearly the ones that they would have no trouble answering, or at least they could develop the answers and they had the information, and they are the regulator for those other entities, and yet they wouldn't answer even those questions. They just turned it all over to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, mostly, or other federal agencies.
It's a convenient strategy, yeah.
Yeah.
You've presented at a whole pile of public hearings.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through a few examples of what your positions were in some of those presentations?
Well, usually it's that, you pick up on some. I like to speak near the very end and then comment on somebody who's said something that I felt was absurd in some way or other. So now that I'm in my 60s, I'll take some notes. I used to try and do it all just off the top of my head, but as I age, I find that it's good to have a couple of little cheat sheets that tell me what I want to talk about. Otherwise, I'll forget one of the 4 or 5 topics that I've come up with that seem worth mentioning. So, and I'm really careful not to use, not to have the guy say, could you wrap it up? You're going a little over our time. And they very seldom have to say that to me. It seems, I don't know, I like to be polite. And even though, of course, in my heart, I want to tell them, you're all liars and murderers. And who do you think you are? But I refrain.
Right. Well, I've presented at a few hearings myself, and I'm one of those presenters who doesn't get that 2.5 hour back and forth. And And I don't think I'm, rude or anything, but I do I think, point out some ideas that they don't want to have mentioned at the hearings. And so when I'm done, they're happy to have me go. But yes, containing your anger. And so do you approach, I like what you said, that you'll comment on things that you thought were misleading at the hearings.
Yeah, I think it's really important not to bring a prepared document, because what's said at the hearing almost invariably needs to be responded to. And so someone like me with 50 years, 45 years of studying this stuff has to be there to say, no, what that person said is not correct, or what that person said. That's just the way I feel that I can be most useful.
Okay, so the way they do it, it would be hard to have yourself come up towards the end of the hearings, because it's somewhat random how they pick who goes on after whom. And
they usually do it in
strategy for that.
They usually do it in the order that you sign up. So I'll get there early, but I won't sign up until near the end. And in fact, the pro-nukers at the San Onofre hearings that they used to have, they don't have hearings for it anymore now that it's closed. But they started to get wise to my doing that, and they would wait until the very end so they could get the last word, which I wasn't trying to get the last word. I was trying to correct the most important things that were said. So it didn't really bother me that they would, wait till I had signed up before they'll sign up. But I did notice them starting to do that.
Well, how it's done here is that there's a deadline by which you submit a written submission. And then there's another little deadline a few weeks after that by which you can't send in your slides and supplementary slides for your presentation.
Oh, we don't get to do supplementary slides or play a video or anything like that.
And you don't submit a written submission months before you make your oral presentation.
I seldom do. Sometimes I'll make a written submission. I haven't been doing a lot of newsletters lately. I had done, 500 newsletters, something in an awful lot of newsletters. But I slowed down. And so now I'm lucky if I do 2 in a year.
So how does an American participate at one of these NRC hearings? They show up at the date and time of the hearings, and you sign a sheet that you want to present. So it's not all planned in advance.
Correct. And you can submit, a written statement to go with your oral comments. And you can do that ahead of time and sometimes afterwards as well.
So, I noticed on your website, EPA tritium standards. So, my rundown on tritium, my understanding is that the American limit in drinking water is 740 becquerels per liter. Yeah. But in California, isn't it something like 70, or it's quite low?
Yeah, I believe it's a lot lower in California. I haven't looked at the standards in a while. And I think that those documents were written just before the standards got changed. So I'm not real up on what the current standard is in California. Canada has a much bigger tritium problem because your reactors produce 10 times, they produce 30 times more tritium than our light water reactors do. Because
my data on that is, and this is from R.G. Briggs from Oak Ridge National Labs. Apparently, CANDU reactors make 100 times, at least just based on my research, than a comparable U.S. PWR. But either way, but the
Okay.
Canadian standard for tritium in drinking water is 7,000 becquerels per liter.
But of course, I mean, these standards are set to a LARA as low as reasonably
Right.
Is a standard that is basically is set so that the company can operate, or the whatever it is that they want to do can be done. To try and operate the CANDU reactors with the 700 standard or the 70 standard would be virtually impossible. So they have a 7,000 standard. It's got nothing to do with the health risks, really. It's as low as reasonably achievable and still do it.
I find the trick now in the industry is whenever you dig a hole and you find some water and you test it and you find radioactive elements in it, you only talk about the tritium. I've noticed. So, like, right, I think today the story is that they're going to have public hearings on how to deal with a lot of this water in the Fukushima prefecture, but they're only talking about the tritium ore. I mean, up here, if you dig a hole at Bruce Nuclear, you're going to find water with 50,000 becquerels per liter. If you dig a hole outside of Pickering, I think it was 15,000 becquerels per liter in some of their test wells. And the question is always, if that's what the tritium concentration in that water is, what about all the other radio elements? I just find they're all talking about tritium, and why are they all talking about tritium? It's because somebody will say, oh, it's a lower energy radioactive particle, and the sun makes it, and all this hocus pocus. And meanwhile, people don't realize if you take a sample from the middle of Lake Huron, it's 2.14 becquerels per liter. When you start getting closer to these plants, obviously that gets a little higher. But what about the other? Where there's smoke, there's fire. What about the other pollutants?
There's, I would assume, I would like to say there's undoubtedly other radioactive elements besides the tritium, although perhaps most of the radioactivity, in those samples is going to be from the tritium. But let me say something about the tritium. You mentioned that you thought it was because it's a low-energy beta emitter, and so with a 12-year half-life, so considered not quite so dangerous as some of the others, which are perhaps alpha emitters or have much longer half-lives.
For the record, I'm not saying that I feel it's less dangerous. I'm saying that they use that as an argument, and I'm suggesting that's why they only talk about tritium. But
here's
go on. Explain. Yeah, exactly.
Here's the catch about that.
Go ahead.
When they say it's a lower energy beta emitter, that it is true that the energy level of the beta particle is much lower than some of the others when it's released. However, the way a beta particle does damage is it's an electron. Okay, a beta particle is an electron that's been emitted from a nucleus of an atom at a very high speed. So until it slows down, it's considered a beta particle, and then once it's slowed down, it's considered an electron. As a beta particle, so when it's moving very rapidly, 99-something% the speed of light, it goes by other atoms and other electrons and other protons so fast that it doesn't have time to do damage. It's not until it gets to the end of its track, and this is true for any beta particle, not just tritium. It's not until it gets to the end of its track and it's slowed down that it can do any damage. This is, for example, a comparison would be to imagine iron filings on a piece of paper, and you have a magnet. Now, if you put that magnet near those iron filings, they're all going to orient themselves towards the lines of magnetism in the magnet, right? Everybody knows that. You did that experiment in 4th grade or something. Well, if you take that magnet and you whip it past those iron filings at a very high speed, it's not going to affect them at all. They're just going to sit there because there wasn't enough time for them to reorient themselves before the magnet was gone. So the beta particle doesn't do its damage until it gets to the end of its track, in the same way that the magnet doesn't do its damage unless it's moving slow enough. So the fact that it's a low-energy beta particle is essentially utterly irrelevant to whether or not it's damaging. All of them only do their damage at the low end that they all eventually reach. So that it's a low-energy beta particle is not only irrelevant, but most of the time radiation effects are measured in total energy dump per pound or kilogram of the human body, of flesh or whatever. And so in that respect, tritium is actually far more damaging because it's low energy, because you have more beta particles for the same amount of energy, and each beta particle doesn't do its damage until it gets to the end. So they're really twisting the effects. And then there's other effects about tritium, which is that it's usually bound up in a water molecule, so it's a HTO instead of H2O, where the T is a tritium atom, the H is a hydrogen atom, and the O is an oxygen atom. So instead of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, it's still 2 hydrogens, but one of the hydrogens is tritium, so it's HTO. When that tritium particle decays, it it leaves the atom, the molecule, and you have all you have left is an HO, which is it's a free radical, and it's going to cause a lot of damage. A free radical will pull off an electron from somewhere, and then it'll that wherever it got that electron, that particle is going to need to pull off another electron from something, and it works its way down the chain. And it's perhaps the most damaging part of tritium is this free radical that gets left over when it decays.
And
So-
OH is corrosive, is it?
Yeah, that too. And it could be anywhere in your body, because water could be anywhere in your body. So,
And then the problem with tritium is that it can be ubiquitous. We can breathe it as steam. We can drink it as water. It can get into our food. That whatever concentration of tritium is found in the environment will be the concentration that you find in the people living in the environment.
yeah, and it can go anywhere in the body. I mean, water's we're, 70-80% water. I forget the exact number, but, it doesn't, it doesn't leave the body. Some portion of the tritium is liable to stay for a long time inside the body. A biological half-life and a radiological half-life are two very different things. So although if you get to a clean environment, once you've been irradiated with tritium, a lot of the tritium will, leave the body through, urination or exhaling. But a certain portion of it is not, about 2%, is not going to leave anytime soon. So,
One of the most, I think, sort of misleading concepts when we talk about half-life is this, let's say we call tritium as a half-life of 12 years. But the misconception, that might be great if you have 2 chunks of tritium. But if you have an incredibly high concentration of tritium beyond imagination, if a certain percentage of it disappears after a certain time, it still just means that after 12 years, if you had an incredibly high concentration, you might still have an incredibly high concentration of it.
well, absolutely. And in fact, a teaspoon contains, trillions and trillions of atoms of tritium. It's an incredibly hazardous substance in very minute quantities. A normal, any radioactive substance, people talk about 10 half-lives before you can start to think of it as being gone. But some of the experts that I've talked to feel that really we should be talking about at least 20 half-lives. So a millionth of a millionth would be what would be gone after 20 half-lives, roughly a millionth of a millionth. The 10 half-lives, it's just not enough.
And just for listeners, a half-life just means that half of it might have degraded. And that's why I said if you had an incredibly high concentration, a huge amount of it, the fact that half of it's gone is almost meaningless. It's still there. It's still, right?
Well, yeah, I don't know that I'd call it almost meaningless, but yeah, it's still there.
Your book, The Code Killers, I'm assuming this is what we're getting into, is the damage that these radioactive elements do to tissues and organs.
Yeah, I wrote that about 10 years ago when I had bladder cancer, and I had no idea whether or not they had managed to get it all out, which was done surgically, and so I figured, well, I better write down what I know before it's too late. And it started out as a poster, and then I realized I was going to need several posters, and by the time I had done 8 or 10 posters, I decided that it better turn it into a book. So that's how the book came about.
And people can read that for free?
Yeah, it's available online, and they're welcome to copy it too. That's at my acehoffman.org website in several different resolutions. So if you have a slow internet, you can download the smaller version, and if that's not a problem, you can get the high-res version and then print it out or just read it online as a PDF.
And people can buy a hardcover copy from you.
Yeah, right now I've been offering it for $25 because the printing costs have been as high as $15 or more for binding and printing it here at home. But I think I can do it on books on demand for for about $6 each book, in which case that's basically what I'll charge, or just let people cover costs. So I'm going to come out with a new version of it one of these days, hopefully this year, and cut the price down to $5 or $6, or $6 plus shipping, or they can order it. Hopefully I can find a place where they can actually order it, and they'll pay the shipping and they'll pay the $6 directly to the printing company. I won't even have to get involved with it.
And this is in '08, before Fukushima. And so once again, I mean, a lot of people got interested in this, after Fukushima. You've been on this for a long time. So how do you think Fukushima, did it change any of your convictions? I guess not. I mean,
surprisingly little, because in part, well, obviously there was Chernobyl before that, and 3 Mile Island and Santa Susana, and quite a few other partial meltdowns, Sellafield, and so on. So there's been an enormous number of accidents prior to Fukushima, and there was a earthquake event in Japan that nearly caused a meltdown at a complex of, I think, 7 reactors, and they got by the skin of their teeth in that one. So Fukushima was pretty much something that was expected to happen, and then it happened. And my prediction, I'll say it now, so in case it happens tomorrow, we can say I predicted it. It's that China's going to have the next nuclear accident, because they're incredibly corrupt. They're building reactors, there's dozens of them that are in the process of being built. There's no public input. They're buying them from corrupt companies, the Westinghouse and so forth. I don't think there's any chance. It looks
they're
bad.
buying a lot of can-dos.
Are they?
And SNC-Lavalin. Oh yeah. We're selling them our Canadian can-dos. No one else will buy them, obviously, but and I think usually, isn't it that the maker often loans the money for the build? Is a new pattern that's emerged.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Well, I don't know if you know anything about SNC-Lavalin. So in Canada, from the 40s, every penny, the atomic energy sector wanted was supplied essentially by taxpayers. So for decades, we funded an entity called AECL. They designed, invented, owned the license for CANDO. They were going to sell them. And then there's lots of examples of it. They sold them. They could, that's a whole story in itself. But SNC-Lavalin. So our last prime minister, a conservative, Stephen Harper, gave AECL to SNC-Lavalin for $15 million after we had spent, billions of taxpayer dollars for decades on this AECL. They give it to this evil corporation, SNC-Lavalin, who, you can just... that's a whole Googling episode in itself, with charges of corruption, banned by contracts by the World Bank, controversy after controversy. They build prisons and dark sites all over the world. They were shuttling off Gaddafi's sons while the Americans were at war with Libya. Every possible bribery scandals, you name it. Cost overruns, on and on and on and on. So Canada's in the mix of these Chinese reactors. Sorry to derail your point.
Well, they may not be very safe reactors either, so
right.
I'm not sure that it derails anything, yeah. I think South Korea has a CANDO reactor that they've decided to close down.
Yeah.
They're not going to relicense it, and in fact they're going to shut it down early.
Well, it was after, I can't help myself, it was after selling CANDO reactors to India that resulted in the Indians' weapons test in 1974. But it turns out that even in 1971, I think we were selling CANDO technology to Pakistan. So we essentially, just this province alone, fueled an arms race between India and Pakistan. And then when you start tracing these other countries like Iran and North Korea, and other problem states that have gotten technology from Pakistan, it again comes back to Ontario. So we're not innocent in the proliferation problem.
Well, there's a big advantage to a can-do reactor for a small country, which is that they don't have to enrich the uranium. It uses natural uranium, so that makes it a lot easier. It avoids an entire step in the production of the fuel for the reactor.
They do need seed fuel to get it started, though, from what I understand.
Do they?
But, well, to get it started.
Okay.
Because the uranium-238 isn't fissile, so they have to start it with something. It's the same thing with the thorium argument, how they claim the thorium isn't fissile, but they have to start it with something to get it rolling. What do you make of the thorium and the SMRs and this whole attempt to rejuvenate the nuclear industry? Is it going to get away with it?
No, both of those are old ideas that were rejected long time ago for a variety of reasons, that they were not practical. The thorium reactors require a sodium coolant, which is very difficult to work with and corrosive. And small modular reactors are not going to... The whole reason we went to big reactors was because you couldn't make any money or operate them at a cost effectively at anything less than 800 or 1,000 megawatts. And now they want to build reactors that are producing maybe 70 megawatts, and they're not going to be very efficient in terms of the amount of waste that they produce. They may be able to operate with fewer technicians, but they're still going to need the same kind of security around them. That's going to cost a lot of money. And they're going to produce more waste per kilowatt of energy that they produce. I don't think of reactors as being energy producers. I think of them as being waste producers. For 20 years, I've called San Onofre not San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, but San Onofre Nuclear Waste Generating Station, because that's really the end product. Everything else is a fleeting, electricity doesn't last but a millisecond, a fraction of a millisecond, whereas the nuclear waste lasts for thousands of years. So you tell me which one is the real product that's being created. It's nuclear waste. I did want to mention one more thing about my book, just because, and that's that when I wrote it, obviously I was afraid I was going to pass away, but it did occur to me that I might not. And so I wrote it in such a way that it would be a guidebook for me and anyone else. When you're actually at a hearing and they say something stupid, you can flip to the part of the book that is, that covers that topic. And that's why the book is so colorful, and each page is unique, so that it's not just dry text where you can't find what you need when you need it in a hurry when you're listening to a hearing. So in that respect, it's very different from every other book on the subject. One person described it as a graphic novel, except that it's real. And I gave out about 80 copies at a San Onofre hearing one time. I didn't expect this, but for some reason, a lot of employees showed up at that hearing, and I just stood at the door as they left and handed out copy after copy after copy. A little while later, one of the control room operators, I was doing it at a second hearing, and he said, "Oh, I have a copy, and I like it. I actually like it." That's what he said to me. Another thing that happened is 3 months after I gave out those 80 copies, the reactor company fired something like 70% of their employees. They got rid of one of the contractors and got all new employees. Now, whether or not that's related to the book, I don't know, but it's an interesting coincidence. And a whistleblower who was talking to me about bad welds that they were doing for the dry casks, that when they weld the top, they weren't setting the numbers properly on the automatic welding machines, and they were covering this up and intimidating the workers. And he told me that they were not allowed to go to my website in the training rooms. There's actually a note that says you can't go to this website. So for those reasons, I'm rather proud of the book, and I hope everyone will download it and read it. And you don't need to pay me anything. You can just do that. It's free. And I hope everyone enjoys the book.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
What's on your agenda next in terms of your going to public hearings?
Well, the last few hearings that I went to physically, not over the phone, were in New Mexico to oppose the Holtec's plan to put all 100,000 tons of nuclear spent fuel in one location on the borders of two counties two very poor counties in New Mexico. And it's strongly opposed by a lot of the New Mexican citizens, but it's being rammed down their throats by Holtec and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the entire nuclear industry wants to build this plant. And a lot of the NIMBY activists around here think that's the best thing to do with the waste. But they're completely ignoring the problems that it entails of transporting the waste twice, first to the interim storage site and then to some permanent storage, which they keep saying is going to be Yucca Mountain. But I was at a lot of those hearings in Nevada, and the Yucca Mountain had hundreds of technical problems, some of which are just not solvable. Like, how do you solve it's in a volcanic area that is still active? How do you solve, it's going to leak into an aquifer? These are not resolvable, but these are the kinds of problems. They wanted there was water dripping through the mountain onto the spent fuel. They wanted to solve that problem by building a 4-inch thick titanium drip shield on top. But the problem there is that 4-inch titanium drip shield is heavy enough to damage the fuel canisters if they fall on them. And what's going to stop the titanium drip shield from falling over the next couple of centuries or thousands of years? So that turned out not to be a very good solution either. There's just, Yucca Mountain is never going to happen. Everyone in Nevada opposes it, and it's unworkable. Even California had almost 24 technical objections to the plan when it was canceled, so they didn't have to answer all these objections. And some of those were, unsolvable, like the aquifer underneath it flows into Death Valley, and we don't want your radioactive waste coming into our state. So Yucca Mountain's not going to happen, and it was a last resort. The scientists who were working on Yucca Mountain were allowed to come up with any alternative if they could find one that was better, as long as it wasn't the same thing in a different location. That was the only restriction. And they looked at other issues. They looked at rocketing it into space. They looked at dumping it into the ocean. They probably even looked at putting it under the ice caps, which are melting away. But they couldn't find anything that was a better solution than Yucca Mountain, in their opinion. And yet, even there were too many problems. Now, of course, the federal government wasn't identifying those problems, but Nevada and California were. So, if the waste goes to an interim storage site, that really means that's where it's going to stay, because there's not going to be a permanent storage site. And in Nevada, in New Mexico, they just want to collect it all up in one place. Now, once you've got it all in one place, the nuclear industry is going to say, well, let's reprocess it because it's all in one place. Reprocessing is a very dirty operation, and all it produces is fuel that can be used for maybe 1 or 2 more times before you can't even reprocess it again. So it might extend the life of some, or the ability to get fuel at a less cost than if you have to mine it and buy it from Canada or wherever. But it's not a very good solution, and it's extremely expensive and dirty. But with all of it in one place, that's probably what they're thinking they're going to do with it.
So a couple notes. So the idea that Holtec is the proponent of this plan for interim storage is no coincidence that Holtec is the main maker of these dry casks. So
right.
they would stand to make a whole bunch. That's why they're so into it.
It's going to make billions and billions of dollars for Holtec, no question.
Yeah.
And it's going to allow reactors that really should have shut down decades ago to keep operating, because they'll be able to ship their fuel away, and then their pools will be emptier and they won't have dry casks on site, which is fine for the local the local area to not have those things. But they're still going to have an operating reactor, which is, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, probably 1,000 times more dangerous. So it solves really nothing. It enables the industry to keep going without having actually come up with a solution to the problem. And New Mexico doesn't want it, and so we went down there and assured them that not every activist near San Onofre thinks it's a good idea either. And I gave out a bunch of my book.
We just had hearings at Chalk River, it's not a electric producing nuclear installation, but it's where most of the R&D and medical isotopes, and it's a sandbox for suit dummies essentially, but it's an ongoing disaster. We wouldn't believe the stuff that's heard at these hearings. It's off the scale. And there was a 1952 meltdown of the NRX reactor. There's been a couple meltdowns. I think Jimmy Carter visited in 1952 to help Canada with its nuclear meltdown, a little historical note. But at these hearings, we're hearing about, examples of, when they had their meltdowns, they literally dug a hole in the sand and dragged the reactor core using a transport truck into a hole and then buried it in sand, so when it rains, you can... And so there's the local indigenous population, there's a river nearby. It's an ongoing disaster. And so, if there are these hearings and there are environmental impact studies, and if you could come away from those hearings with some kind of reassurance that at least people are talking about this stuff. I noticed in the paper a couple days ago that CNL, which is the corporation that's operating the site currently, there are plans afoot for fuel reprocessing. And wouldn't that be after it's been, everywhere it's ever been tried has been a disaster?
An environmental disaster, yeah.
Yeah, and a financial one.
Yeah.
I mean, France, that site, La Hague, they run radioactive waste out to sea by pipe. I mean, it's not a good track record. Japan's attempts at fuel reprocessing, I think that Manju is another example of just constant failure. 40 years, nothing produced.
Yeah, I think Manju was I think a breeder reactor, but
the breeder reactor.
Tokamai, I think, was the reprocessing site.
Okay.
So yeah, reprocessing is dangerous and dirty and expensive, and accomplishes very little even when it works.
And it's my understanding that if you were to weigh a fuel rod, so the zirconia, the whole thing, after reprocessing, you only could possibly recover less than 1% by weight of a spent fuel rod for reprocessing purposes. So what do you do with the other 99%? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And just because you've removed a few fissile elements from a spent fuel rod, what about all the rest of the waste in the fuel rod? What do you do with that? So you're not reducing your volume. As you say, you could just buy fresh uranium and enrich it, probably for cheaper. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I think they might be able to use the U-238 as well, in which case it's only the fission products that are that they don't know what to do with, and that some of them they store, some of them they release into the atmosphere, and some of them they dump into the ocean, at least at La Hague. So, yeah, and then you reuse it and create more fission products. The creation of fission products is really the worst part of a nuclear reactor, because a lot of them mimic useful atoms that the body wants, and so we readily take them in and keep them, like cesium and strontium and so forth. So the fission products are really the creation of fission products is the big problem with nuclear reactors, or the biggest problem, I think. Obviously, the creation of plutonium, the plutonium can then be used in nuclear weapons, and plutonium has a 225,000 year half-life. These are all huge problems as well. It's all a problem. I wanted to mention something about the hearings that I watched yesterday, the Canadian hearings. They mentioned design basis accidents. That's an interesting phrase, because basically what it refers to is all the accidents that your regulator has determined could possibly happen. And they can be pretty serious accidents. But then after Fukushima, they had to admit that that things could be worse than a design basis accident. And they came up with the phrase of beyond design basis accidents. And that's what we have. We have that now. They have to admit that those could happen and plan some sort of mitigation for it, which generally means evacuation, which will not be successful. And I was very interested to hear that in Canada, and I don't think we have this here, you actually have a third category called severe beyond design basis accidents. A design basis accident can already be severe. A beyond design basis accident is by definition severe. What in the world is the difference between that and a severe beyond design basis accident? It's a mystery to me. I found that fascinating.
Right. Well, now, hang on. I think those extra categories came after decades of arguing and fighting by environmentalists to get the regulator to even accept the possibility. In fact, even in those hearings, they tried to tie it to an earthquake. They always do that. We're never going to have a Fukushima-style tsunami on the shore of Lake Ontario, and so therefore these worse-than-design-based accidents could never happen. They had worked it. So, and in fact, only in the last few years were they forced to look at scenarios where because if it depends on how you word it. So we're not going to have the same cause of a nuclear accident here, but we could have the same release as a Fukushima-style accident for any number of possible reasons. But they were never willing to plan for that in terms of evacuation or the KI distribution or accept it in any way because of its probability. And so this is a kind of new thing that came post-Fukushima, this effort to get the regulator to design for a worse than their best case nuclear accident.
Right, and it's all based on probabilities, as you mentioned. The Yucca Mountain team did not have to concern themselves with any accident scenario that the team itself deemed had a less than, I think it was 1 in 6 million or 1 in 10 million. It was one of those two numbers, but it's been 15 years since I saw it. But anyway, any accident with less than that likelihood was simply irrelevant. So asteroids. There's no concern about asteroids, even though an asteroid struck the Nevada test site 60,000 years ago or something. And, of course, there's that wonderful, huge asteroid hole in Arizona, not terribly far away from either Holtec or Nevada, Yucca Mountain, kind of in between the two. We visited when we were coming back from New Mexico, and it's pretty impressive. It would completely pulverize any collection of nuclear waste underneath it. But that's not the only. I mean, asteroids hit the Earth all the time, every day. There's some asteroids, some number, several tons worth hitting the atmosphere, and some of them get through.
One of those presentations was Jack Gibbons, who I've been lucky enough to have on my show. He pointed out in one of his presentation for Ontario Clean Air Alliance that despite how low you may calculate the probability, no reasonable person can argue that the probability is zero. Mm-hmm. And yes, therefore, if there's alternatives and there's no need and there's cost, it's not cost effective, then why would you take that risk, no matter how low the risk probability could be calculated to be?
Right. I thought he was wonderful in those hearings that I listened to. I was very impressed. Yeah. And one other point about the accident scenarios is using this 1 in 6 million or 1 in 10 million, they were able to eliminate basically thousands of potential accidents that could happen. And if you go to a hearing on at a nuclear power plant and start complaining about the possibility of a 9/11 type scenario, they have a very weird response here in America. They say, that's not our problem, TSA will prevent that from happening.
Right.
TSA can't really, they're not going to be effective against, for example, a terrorist group renting a mid-sized jet and putting anything they want on board it and then flying it into a nuclear reactor. The TSA is only working at the airports for commercial flights. There's lots of ways. Right. I mean, not saying anyone's going to do this, but you could go up in a balloon above a nuclear waste site and drop a spear, a heavy spear, obviously, but that would go right through everything. That would create an enormous release. If you go a mile or so high in a balloon, that spear is going to be coming down awfully fast, and it's heavy and it's pointed, and it can go through. You don't even need an explosive on the tip of it, but there's plenty of those available too that'll go through many feet of concrete and many inches of steel. We have a military base right next to San Onofre. In fact, it's literally on the military base. It's land that they've rented from the base.
Yeah.
And we had a guy steal a tank, not from the base, but from a nearby National Guard site about 20 years ago, and he drove it all over the place, drove it over cars and campers for like an hour and a half or so before he tried to cross the lanes of a highway to attack oncoming traffic, and he got hung up on the concrete barriers between the two halves, and thank goodness he did, because otherwise he would have started really killing. He managed to not kill anybody despite all the vehicles he drove over. And then a rather brave policeman climbed on top of the tank, opened the door, told him to put his hands up, and he didn't fast enough, and the cop shot him and killed him. But he was trying to get the vehicle off the Jersey barrier so he could continue his rampage. So imagine if somebody, then there was a pilot, a U.S. Air Force pilot, or maybe a Marine pilot, but I think it was Air Force, who flew his A-10, I think it was an A-10 Warthog. It was a very deadly airplane, carries depleted uranium bullets. He flew it around for an hour and then crashed into a mountain. Obviously, he could have crashed into anything he wanted to. He could, probably managed to use live weapons, because they do testing with live weapons, or training with live weapons now and again. There was the German Wings pilot that crashed his airplane into a mountain. There was the MH370, Malaysian Airlines, was probably a suicide pilot, although at the moment we don't know, and we probably never will know. There was one in the St. Lawrence River that I think that was Egypt Air, that might have been a suicidal pilot. And in the 70s, there was a terrorist, a hijacker, who threatened to crash an airplane into a nuclear power plant if they wouldn't let him fly to Cuba or something like that. So to say these can't happen is absolutely ridiculous. They've been happening all along, and nuclear power plants have been threatened. And yet there's pro-nukers who are saying, well, since the hijackers in 9/11 were considering attacking a nuclear power plant but chose not to, clearly that's not what anyone's ever going to do. That's just ridiculous. Clearly they are going to do it. It's just a matter of time.
I was going to mention that, the speculation that was one of their alternative targets. Well, and I mean, I don't want to give anyone ideas, but I mean, it's my understanding that almost all these nuclear power plants, they can't last more than 7 to 21 hours without electricity. So couldn't somebody just sit in the field, in the hills, with a grenade, and every time they reconnect the power, interrupt the power? I mean, there's any number of a million ways you could cause events that lead to loss of coolant, loss of power, loss of pumping. They're vulnerable in so many ways.
I don't think they'd let someone continue to sit there and lob grenades at it, but for 7 to 21 hours, somebody would get on their case. But they can certainly break the the power cables, the transmission lines that bring off-site power to the plant. Those aren't that difficult to destroy, and then the diesel generators could easily be destroyed. And once you've destroyed both of those, all they have is battery backup. Whether or not they would be able to get in new diesel generators and get them hooked up before there's a meltdown, that would be questionable. Not to give anyone any ideas, but that's how simple it is. Yeah. There's really a concerted effort to destroy a nuclear power plant would succeed. Although probably the most likely scenario is going to be an insider job, in which somebody has, passed the tests, gotten in, gets turned somehow, and opens doors for terrorists to come in or does something themselves. In India, the head of the police department that was the security for the nuclear power site turned out to be a turncoat of some sort, and they caught him in time before he was able to damage a reactor. But I think he killed 2 other policemen, if I recall. This was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So to me, that's probably the most likely way that there's going to be eventually a meltdown caused by a terrorist. Is he's going to be someone who actually works at the plant. It could be a crazy person like the Germanwings pilot or the MH370 pilot or whatever, and it could be, someone in the control room. It could be anybody.
Well, we export these nuclear reactors to hotspots that can quickly fall out of our influence. And an example, that really alarmed me was, for a brief moment, there was conventional warfare in Ukraine, which is dotted with nuclear power plants. And the idea that an AMRAAM or surface to air or whatever munition, that they got some rule, of honor not to, involve a nuclear power plant in their conventional war theater, it's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, it's probably not so much a rule of honor as that a lot of countries, when they build their nuclear power plants, they build them on a spit of land that goes out into another country. And so that other country is not going to want to destroy that reactor because the radioactive plume is going to actually impact their country more than the one that it actually belongs to. This is a common practice. If you just look at the lines of the lines of the country boundaries and where the nuclear power plants are located. I mean, it's not always true, but a lot of them do that. But seeing one destroyed in a so-called conventional war is entirely possible. And in fact, there was a scholarly book published in I think University of California or one of those California universities, called "Nuclear Power Plants as Weapons for the Enemy and Unrecognized, Peril." Or that's approximately what the title is. And this book is, 25 years old or so.
Huh.
It's not like
I call them self-installed landmines myself.
Yeah, well, landmines might be a bit of an understatement, but certainly it's the right idea.
One of the things that I found interesting watching your meltdown with Trump and the Russian investigation was that some of these deals that are questionable were nuclear-related deals abroad. I think that's something I want to learn more about. And so it brings us back to this idea that, if you're looking for a mix of politics and self-enrichment, and if you follow the money, they would go back to giant projects, because with giant projects, there's more room to skim off the top. So I just wonder if that's a real example of, corporations mixing with government, with people who are up for their own self-enrichment and pushing public policy. And they would focus around nuclear plants and projects because they're always, by the tens of billion.
Yeah, the heads of the corporations can certainly make, wildly high salaries for many years. In China, it's invariably, done through graft and corruption. And in fact, sometimes they get caught and executed in China. The punishments are pretty severe there. Here in America, you barely even have to give the money back if you get caught. You might do a couple of years in jail, and your offshore accounts are still safe.
Mm-hmm. Is it harder in our current culture, where we seems like we can't vote correctly anymore, and we're fragmented and distracted between the cell phone and the Netflix and the million other ways that we've become fractured? Is it harder to amalgamate a movement to fight things like environmental issues, nuclear specifically, but there's a whole host of problems? Are we too fractured? Is there something about our current culture that makes it harder now? Or are you an optimist?
What is it? If you're an optimist, you think things will get good. If you're a pessimist, you think things will get bad. And if you're a realist, you'll realize that the pessimist is right. It's hard to be optimistic these days. I guess the most optimistic I can be is that we'll survive a little longer. That it won't be this problem that does us all in the near future. It'll be some other problem a little bit later. But that's still optimism, I suppose. Maybe it's pessimism to think that we're all going to die eventually, but, the sun's going to explode in so many billions of years, and we're all going to die. Asteroid's probably going to hit us first, and we're all going to die. The asteroid's going to hit a nuclear power plant or a nuclear waste disposal area that was supposedly safe, and we're all going to die. So we're going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of fuel, we're going to, the oceans are going to rise, something's going to happen. A disease that we can't cure is going to take over the entire population. Any of these things are possible. So, why worry too much about these sorts of ends when you have a good opportunity right now to solve one problem? And that's what I try to do. Make it be something else that kills us all, and make it be later.
Right. Here in Ontario, I just assume people have heard of Rob Ford. He was the mayor of Toronto, the crack.
Yeah.
Crazy, insane. Well, his brother ran for and has now become the Premier of Ontario.
Okay.
And he's one of these typical conservatives. He bought up a lot of votes by promising things for Joe and Jane's six-pack, like buck a beer. And as he's assumed office, there was a moment in the campaign where his adversary, the leader of what we call the NDP, New Democratic Party here, was standing up front of Pickering saying that she would close it down, which is what it was supposed to do in 2016 or 14 anyway. And then a couple of days later, Doug Ford's out there outside of the plant saying all of your jobs would be lost if we shut it down. And so we've got this conservative. He's come in. He's changing sex education. He is just canceled some 700 and some odd wind and solar contracts. He's probably going to roll back our attempt to create a minimum wage increase here. Like I said, buck a beer. You get the idea.
Yeah, sounds like a typical conservative.
We can't vote. And then we look at the Trump. You guys can't vote. Has democracy finally failed?
How badly has democracy failed? Yeah.
No, has it utterly failed? I often imagine that there were intellectuals at the turn of the last century saying, well, how can you have democracy when there's two parties and they vote in solid blocks and they're basically dictators for 4 years? And I think one of these intellectuals must have said, oh, well, it seems to be quite popular and working now. Let's see how long it goes on for. It could last a decade. It could last 50 years. It could last 80 years. It seems to me just by looking that there's some fundamental failure. If the public isn't smart enough to pick a proper leader, if we don't have a media that can hold the feet to the fire, when truth loses any sense of meaning, hasn't democracy failed?
Democracy has failed compared to what? Yes, it's a complete failure, but I don't know of anything that's better. And at least our failure is probably the most important thing is the uneducated public. They're easily swayed by simple arguments, and so the destruction of the education system is the root of all of the failures, in my opinion.
I believe that's true.
The plan, and I think it was Hillary Clinton's plan to standardize, or at least in part her plan, or maybe it was Bush, I can't remember now. But they wanted to make sure that all the teachers were teaching the exact same thing, and that there was no, you didn't have to worry that a teacher was going off on some half-cocked idea and teaching something that they didn't want to teach. Well, that's just completely wrong. Every individual is an expert in something and knows something particularly well. If what a teacher is really knowledgeable about is woodworking, then let them emphasize woodworking in their classes. If they're knowledgeable about, Aaron Burr, then let them teach about him, or, George Washington, or Frederick Douglass, or whatever. And this whole idea that we should standardize is completely wrong. It's much better that we have people that are very knowledgeable about at least something than that we have people who have been taught to a minimum of this, that, and a few other things, but there's nothing that they really are good at. So, and we'd have a country with experts in all kinds of different areas if we would just let the teachers teach what they know the best.
I went to a private school, so this doesn't, for the particular year I'm talking about, so it doesn't apply to public schools, unfortunately, but we were taught math by a former U.S. Air Force navigator. So when he was talking about vectors and wind, I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, you get a whole different level of education from someone like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. But, I may have said this before in this podcast, but one of my first memories was, as a child, first news memories, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, kids flipping through the channels watching cartoons. It must have been a Sunday, and I must have got to the end of the run of the cartoons, and I accidentally turned to Meet the Press. And I swear to God, they were talking about the proposed cuts to education and how one of the pundits was arguing that it could eventually affect our democracy by doing what I suggested before, by creating an uninformed public who's unable to do critical thinking and is distracted by silly stuff and not trained in logical thinking. And here we are.
Here we are, indeed.
That's what you said. The main failure may not be democracy. It could be our having kept up the standards of education for the public at large.
Yeah, and here, of course, you can't get into college without money, or else racking up a huge debt, instead of making college free for everybody like it should be. I just read yesterday that studies are indicated by Timothy Mousseau. His studies have shown that the insects are changing around nuclear reactors.
Yeah, I saw that story.
Here in America, they were going to do a large study of 4 or 5 different around 4 or 5 different reactors to restudy the question of whether or not there are increased cancer cases. And we went to the hearings for the National Academy of Sciences, and spoke passionately about it, along with I think there was one other activist, so there were 3 of us all together, and they had agreed to pick San Onofre as one of the sites that they would study. And then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission canceled the study because they said they didn't have enough money to do it, and it only would have cost between $6 and $10 million, which is a pittance compared to the budget the multi-billion-dollar budget that they've got. They had plenty of money to study it. They didn't want to study it. They didn't want to find out. And especially they didn't want to find out about San Onofre because the study could easily have included the difference between when the reactor was operating and what happened after it shut down. Because between the time that they approved San Onofre as one of the reactors to be studied, it closed down permanently. And so the effect could be quite clear. It would be quite easy, really, to study that. Yeah. But they canceled the study. So, yeah, they don't want to know.
That was Ace Hoffman, writer, environmental activist, broadcaster, animation software developer. His book is available for free, The Code Killers. Download it from his website, www.acehoffman.org, ACEHOFFMAN. See our show notes for links and contact info.
Find us on Twitter, @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto.
And I'm Ace Hoffman in Carlsbad, California.